Hey everyone, I want to talk about making a adjustment curve so we can make digital negatives to print photographic processes. We're going to look at the step wedge as a tool that we can use to help us understand curves and how to adjust them. Ultimately, this gets done in photographs, but this can be a great way to help you understand how those materials are reading a negative. So this step wedge is just basic. You've got, let's see, we've got right here 0, 10, 20, 30. So it's just your, white to black in 10 steps, probably 11 steps. And then it has, more fine tune here, really fine tune in the highlights, fine tune in the shadows. And here's like your 5-step increments. So you can really kind of see how different values are separating depending on how you print them on different photo materials. And the process that we're going to go through is the same that if we're using a photograph. So if I'm have a digital file, it's open here, that becomes your base layer. And then the next thing that you want to do, things we need to check. I'm not getting all my options here. What's my image mode? It's indexed color. That's not what we want. If it's grayscale, it's not what you want. We do want to be an RGB color because we're going to use inkjet printers to do this. They print in CMYK, but they have RGB RIP software that is their base software, so it's best to use that process. All right. Also looking in there, image size, typically you want at least 180 pixels per inch, preferably more. Now you don't, right here I opened up 5x5, 72 pixels per inch. For the step wedge, this is fine because there's not like gradation between values. So you have to be really careful in your photographs that you play with the image size properly. But anyways, I'm actually going to resample this. I don't resample photographs unless I'm downsampling. I never upsample, but this is not going to hurt it. I'm going to make it 180 pixels per inch. So I'm going to shrink it so we can see it again. But all right. So, all right, too big now. Fine, we'll look at this size. All right, so I have this. The next thing, if I were doing a digital file, would be layer, new adjustment layer, and I would just desaturate. So use hue and saturation, and then just desaturate. Now you want to make sure that you get these layers in the correct order. So pay attention over here in your layer palette, what order these things are. So I'm starting from the ground up. The next layer that you're going to want, new adjustment layer, will be a curves layer. So we'll open that, and we're actually going to apply a curve to it, but we'll start with just this curve layer, and then I'm going to build up my last layer. These are your basic layers that you're going to want. And the last one is an invert layer because we need to print a negative. It's because in photography too, negatives make a positive. All right, so you have to remember that. Now ideally, if you make a print of this and you look and compare, pay attention to the numbers rather than the values because black is going to make white and white is going to make black on here. So it's not going to look the same. You have to pay attention to the numbers here. All right, so this is what this looks like in a negative. You can see all these even steps here. We're going to cheat a little bit, and we're actually going to apply an existing adjustment layer that I found online. So I'm going to hit Load Curve Presets. You also see above that Save Curve Presets. So when you make your own presets, you can save them and keep them and apply them to other materials. And that's our goal here, is to make a curve that is somewhat universal for a process. So I have one that I downloaded off the internet, and we're looking at cyanotypes. So I'm going to do cyanotype.acv. So .acv files are these adjustment curve layers. I open that and you instantly see the values change, right? So when we look at this, there's a lot of compression, like suddenly these values, if I turn this off, you see the separation that exists here and here. We kind of lose that a little bit, like they get smushed together, and then there's much bigger jumps here at the other ends. 90 to 100 is a very big jump. And 0 to 10 is a pretty big jump. So when we look at our curve over here, we can see that in actually reading this has been done intentionally. So the blacks are really steep, midtones really flat, kind of shallow movement upwards, and then pretty steep again at the highlights. And we can also see that here, I look at the shadow areas, which would be down here because this is a negative. Big jump here. Somewhat a big jump here, but you also see that this has been pushed up here, and this has only been pushed down a little bit. So this is somewhat common in adjustment curves for printing photographic materials, that the midtones need more density. Everything almost needs more density than just a printing straight from your file to a positive print. So what's a little uncommon in my understanding of this adjustment layer is the blacks actually start at black and the whites end at white. I know when I make adjustment layers for silver prints, I drag this down and I drag the blacks up. So they don't even start at black or white. There's always some density, but not full density ever in the highlights. And that's because different materials react differently to light. Obviously, very high contrast in the midtone range in cyanotypes, and somewhat low contrast in the highlights, and very low contrast in the shadow area. And we can tell that from the steep curve to the shallow curve to the steepness over at the highlights. All right, so what we want to do, I do think that this curve has a lot of points in there, so I'm going to start deleting them. These are probably going to make small changes in it, but not big changes. And to actually make your own adjustments, you actually have to get rid of some of these things. So let's see if we can do this without negative effect. And that jumped up a little bit, and that can make actually a pretty decent difference. But for our purposes, we want to, we want to be able to identify that, and it's hard with all these points. I'm actually going to move this one too. Ooh, look at that. So there's a big hump. That's one thing you want to avoid. There's actually a little posterization here. That's where this value, which is supposed to be darker, is higher than a value that's supposed to be lighter, and that actually inverts a relationship. So that's not good. So actually, if I come back here, maybe I can kind of correct that. All right. So if I look at like 90 to 100, there's a big jump there. And ideally what you want to do is print this off on the material you want it, and then you want to look at this adjustment curve on that material. And you should, if we apply this curve, we should actually get a fairly decent looking photograph with, dark shadows, light highlights, and a pretty good midtone, even though it's compressed here. That's just how the materials read your negatives. So that's what we have to learn, how to make a curve that is read properly for our negatives. All right, so if I want to identify okay, let's look at, 190. That is a shadow area, even though it's light, it's clear and a negative. So if I grab this point, I should, if I move up or down, up is density, adding density, down is lowering density. Left or right typically makes your curve steeper and therefore more contrast. So left, right is contrast, up and down is density. So we need a lot of density to reduce cyanotype, and we've already talked about the different contrasts. All right, so if I grab this here and look at just this area, I should see a fair amount of movement if I start moving this. So if I look a little bit right and it goes white, I move it over here, it gets darker, creates a contrast. So if I were reading my cyanotype and there was a huge gap between 90 and 100, and I'd want to shrink that, in this case, I would actually want to push this to the left, or no, to the right, sorry, and that reduces the contrast between these 2 points. If I push it to the left, it increases the contrast between those 2 points. Now, the hard thing is you can also see other values moving, so sometimes there are unintended consequences as you're moving these points around. And that's the second step that you have to pay attention to. What are the unintended consequences? So, all right. So we can identify any set of values. Like if I want to create more separation between 50 and 70, that's probably going to be here or there. So if I move this down, you can see they're getting lighter here. If I move it up, darker, a little posterization happens. I might be able to move this left. Okay, this one's really creating more separation. I can get more contrast between those. It's probably some combination of those two things that we need to do. So here you go. You can really start to see more contrast coming apparent as I smooth out that curve without that huge shoulder, or just soften that shoulder. Okay, so that's how we adjust this, and this is how we can identify the different values in different points and control their contrast, control the density of them through curves. And so with this process, you want to, try it, fix something, try to make sure you don't negatively affect the things that are working in your curve, and only affecting the areas that you want to change. So you might need to add points, might need to subtract points in there, but ultimately we can strive to make our own curves that work with our images. Okay, if you have any questions, let me know.